So there's this moment near the end of the David and Goliath story that has always bothered me, and I couldn't quite figure out why until very recently. So David has killed Goliath. The Philistine champion is dead on the ground with his head cut off, and the Philistine army is running away, and then Israel's celebrating, and it's over. Victory is theirs. End of story. Except then King Saul turns to his commander and asks this question. He's like, "Who is that young man?" And his commander is just like, "I don't know." And then Saul says, "Well, find out whose son he is." And this has always seemed weird to me because Saul should already know who David is. Because back just a chapter ago, David was brought to Saul's court to play music for him. David ended up becoming Saul's armor bearer, and so they've met multiple times. So why is Saul asking who he is? And for years, I just kind of glossed over this as, I don't know, maybe Saul forgot. Maybe there were two different source documents that got stitched together poorly, and it's one of those things that you notice and then ignore because it doesn't seem to fit. But then I was reading about ancient Near Eastern honor and shame culture, and I actually found that questions in that world weren't always about getting information. They were actually strategic and almost political, and in this case, about honor. Which, hold on to that thought for a second. When I understood what Saul was actually trying to do with the question that he asked, and when I realized that the whole story is actually building towards this moment and not the fight with Goliath, the entire narrative clicked into place in a way that's honestly kind of disturbing, because this isn't actually a story about an underdog defeating a giant as it seems to be commonly portrayed, at least in my opinion. It seems to be a story about a corrupt king trying to steal the glory from the person that God has chosen to replace him. The Goliath fight is just the setup, and I think the real battle happens after, when David now has to choose between taking the easy path and submitting to Saul's manipulation, or trusting that God's plan, which is the plan that makes no sense and puts his life in danger from time to time, is actually going to work out. And I think once you see that, everything else in the story starts to make sense. Why the text spends so much time on David's background, or why it emphasizes that Saul is from the tribe of Benjamin, or why the details about Goliath's armor matter, or even why Saul refuses to wear Saul's armor. Because all of it is pointing towards this final confrontation between David and Saul over who gets the honor. But there's actually more to it than that. Because this is really the wild thing, is when you start looking at who Goliath actually is. Not just as a tall giant guy, but specifically where he's from and what actually that means biblically. Because then you realize that this isn't just a political thing or a war taking out. This is actually spiritual warfare at the highest level, and actually a continuation of a conflict that goes back to Genesis 3 in the Garden of Eden. And it's going all the way forward to the cross. So that's what I want to talk about today. We're going to be looking at what really is happening in the David and Goliath story. And of course, we're going to be talking about the ancient Near Eastern worldview and warfare with honor and culture. And then we're going to see how the story fits into the biblical narrative about the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent. And I think by the end, you're going to see this passage in a completely different way. And as always, I really hope you enjoyed the video. If you enjoy exploring the weird parts of the Bible, please consider hitting the subscribe button, as there's just a vast world of the Bible that needs to be explored. And I would love it if you came on this journey with me. Oh, and also one more thing. YouTube apparently has this new feature called Hype, and I think it's only on mobile, but it helps smaller channels like me get discovered. So if you're on mobile, please consider hitting the Hype button below the video. Anyways, let's get into it. All right, so to understand what's actually happening in this story, we need to start with King Saul, because this whole narrative is set up as a contrast between Saul, who was the failed king, and then David, the king God actually wants. So here's the situation, just briefly. The Philistines and Israelites are camped on opposite sides of the valley of Elah. And for 40 days, this Philistine champion named Goliath comes out and then challenges Israel to single combat. And winner takes all. So if Israel's champion wins, the Philistines become their servants. And then if Goliath wins, Israel becomes servants to the Philistines. This is called champion warfare, and it was a real thing back in the ancient Near East. And the idea is, instead of both of these armies getting slaughtered, you would just let your best warriors fight it out. So the outcome was taken as a sign of which side the gods favored. So this wasn't necessarily just a military term, it was theological in this sense. Goliath is essentially saying, my god Dagon is stronger than your god Yahweh, so prove me wrong. And for 40 days, Goliath comes out morning and evening and is just pretty much insulting Israel the whole time. In an honor and shame culture, this is pretty devastating, because every day that passes without someone accepting the challenge Israel is publicly admitting that their God can protect them. Their honor was being systematically destroyed in front of all the other nations. So who should be stepping forward to fight, really? And obviously, that's the king. That's literally what Israel asked for back in the earlier parts of 1 Samuel. They wanted a king like all the other nations who would go out before them and fight their battles. And then you have Saul. The text tells us that he stood head and shoulders above all other Israelites. So he's physically imposing, he's the king, and he's the obvious choice to be Israel's champion here. But here's what makes this even more significant, because Saul is from the tribe of Benjamin. Now, if you know your Old Testament, you would know that each tribe had certain specialties, if you want to call them. Judah produced leaders. Levi was the priestly tribe. But Benjamin actually produced pretty elite slingers. So in Judges 20, during a civil war between Benjamin and the rest of Israel, we get this description. Among all these were 700 chosen men who were left-handed. Everyone could sling a stone at a hair and not miss. 700 expert slingers from Benjamin. These dudes were legendary. And everyone in Israel would have known this because it was essentially part of their military tradition. So Saul, the Benjaminite king, whose tribe is famous for producing warriors that could kill a man at 200 yards with a sling, should also be the obvious choice to walk out there and end this. Instead, he's hiding in his tent. The text says he and all of Israel were dismayed and greatly afraid for 40 days, and then ultimately David shows up. Now, David hasn't come to fight. He actually came to deliver food to his brothers who were in the army. But when he gets there and he hears Goliath's challenge, he just starts asking questions, and not quietly. So he ends up walking through the camp, publicly asking everyone there, well, what's going to be done for the man who kills this Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel? And then he says this, who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? Let's pause on that word uncircumcised for a second. That's not just an insult. That's almost a theological statement, because circumcision was the sign of the covenant. It meant that you were in relationship with Yahweh. So Goliath being uncircumcised, which means that he is outside the covenant, which means his gods aren't real, which also means that the God of Israel should obviously be able to defeat him. And so David is saying this out loud in front of soldiers who have been cowering for days. So there we go again. This is a really massive honor challenge. David, this teenage shepherd who literally just arrived, is publicly shaming the entire Israelite army by pointing out what should be obvious, that they're hiding from someone who has no claim on divine protection. And his brother Eliab hears this and gets furious. Classic older brother response. Why did you come down here? Who's watching those few sheep? I know how conceited you are. You just came to watch the battle. But David's response is perfect for the honor-shame dynamic. He doesn't get defensive. He just dismisses it. What have I done now? Can't I even speak? Then he turns away and keeps asking the same questions to the other soldiers. His older brother tried to shame David, and then David's just not having it. But ultimately, his message is working. He's starting to get under people's skin, because word actually gets back to Saul that there's this kid in this camp who's publicly questioning why no one's willing to fight and why the king isn't doing his job. And that puts Saul in a really impossible position, because now David isn't just challenging the honor of the army, he's challenging the honor of the king directly. And think about how shameful this would be. You have this teenage boy, this shepherd, who's walking through your camp, pointing out that you're all afraid to do what you were literally hired to do. And everyone's hearing it. So Saul has David brought to him, and then David says that he'll go and fight Goliath. And Saul's first response is pretty much trying to shame him back. He's just like, you can't go out and fight this Philistine because you're only a boy and he's a warrior from his youth. But then David has an answer. He describes killing lions and bears, plural by the way, that attacked his flock. Hand-to-hand combat with predators that could kill a man. And then he says, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. And it's crazy because at this point, Saul has no comeback because David just upped the honor challenge again. He's saying, the living God is on our side. Why are you afraid? And Saul can't refute that without admitting that he doesn't trust God. So it's a catch-22 situation. So Saul just says, go and the Lord be with you. Get out of here. But he's got a plan. Saul is not done trying to control the situation. And we're going to come back to that. But first, we need to actually talk about who Goliath is for a second, because this guy isn't just some random tall guy from the Philistine army. When we read about Goliath, we usually focus on how big he is. The text says that he's either 6.5 feet tall or 9.5 feet tall, depending on whether you're using the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, and Dead Sea Scrolls, or the later Masoretic text. Jargon, either way, he's significantly taller than the average person in the Iron Age, who would have been around 5.5 feet tall. But the detail that matters most isn't Goliath's height, it's actually where he's from. 1 Samuel 17 verse 4 introduces him as Goliath from Gath. Gath was one of the major 5 Philistine cities, and if you know your Old Testament, Gath should set off alarm bells, because Gath is where the giants are from. Let me show you what I mean. So, back in the book of Joshua, when Israel is conquering the Promised Land, there's this group called the Anakim, essentially giant clans. And Joshua 11, 21 verse 22 tells us what happened to them. At that time, Joshua went and destroyed the Anakim from the hill country, from Hebron, Debir, and Nab, from all the hill country of Judah, and from all the hill country of Israel. Joshua totally destroyed them in their towns. No Anakim were left in Israelite territory. Only in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod did any survive. So only in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod did any Anakim survive. Goliath is from Gath, the place where the giant clan survived. So now you might say, okay, yeah, he's from a place that had tall people, so what? But it goes deeper than that, because the Anakim are connected to something much older and much stranger. In Numbers 13, when Moses sends spies into the Promised Land to scout it out, they actually come back terrified, and they report what they saw. We saw the Nephilim there. The descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim. We seem like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them, the Nephilim. That word should sound pretty familiar. It shows up in Genesis 6 right before the flood. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward when the sons of God went into the daughters of humans and had children by them. Now, there's a lot of debate about what exactly is happening in Genesis 6, and I'm not going to resolve that debate here, but what is clear is that the Nephilim are presented as something that shouldn't exist. They're the result of some kind of boundary crossing between angels and humans that leads directly to the corruption of the earth and the need for the flood. See 2 videos ago, because I explained that whole thing. And then Numbers 13 tells us that the Anakim, the giant clans in Canaan, are descended from the Nephilim. And Joshua goes on to tell us that the remnants of the Anakim survived in Gath. And Goliath is from Gath. So when the original audience hears Goliath from Gath, they're not just hearing big guy from big army. They're hearing descendants of the giant clans that are literally connected to the Nephilim and the corruption of all of humanity from Genesis 6. And just to make this connection even clearer, in 2 Samuel 21, after David is already king, there are actually 4 more battles with the giants. The 4 brothers of Goliath. All of them are from Gath. And all of them are from the family of the Rapha, which is another name for the giant clans. So David's men kill them off one by one. So Goliath isn't alone. He's actually a part of a family, and he has a bloodline. And a bloodline that goes back to the Anakim, which goes back to the Nephilim, which goes back to Genesis 6, and the corruption that led to the flood. So keep that all in mind. We'll come back to it. Now, there's one more detail about Goliath that matters, and it's honestly quite easy to miss. So the text describes his armor in detail. So he has a bronze helmet, bronze greaves, a massive spear, but specifically 1 Samuel 17 verse 5 says that he wore scale armor. Scales, like a serpent, like a dragon. Now, you might think I'm reading too much into this, but biblical authors don't include random details like this. When they take the time to specify what kind of armor someone is wearing, who knows, it might actually matter. Because throughout Scripture, serpent and dragon imagery is consistently associated with God's enemies. The most prominent example of that is Genesis 3 with the Nakash, or the serpent. And then Isaiah and Ezekiel also use dragon imagery for enemy nations. Revelation describes Satan as that ancient serpent and the dragon. And here's Goliath, descendant of the giant clans, connected to the Genesis 6 corruption, wearing scale armor. And it seems to connect something that most people don't think about when they actually read the story. So, way back in Genesis 3, after the fall, God made a promise to the serpent. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel. The seed of the woman will crush the serpent's head. And from Genesis 3 onward, you see this pattern kind of playing out. There's this ongoing conflict between the seed and the woman, or the line that will lead to the Messiah, i.e. Jesus, and the seed of the serpent, or the forces trying to prevent the Messiah or Jesus from coming. Cain kills Abel. The world becomes corrupt with the Nephilim requiring the flood. The giant clans occupy the promised land, trying to prevent Israel from taking possession. Pharaoh tries to wipe out all of Israel in Egypt. Haman tries to destroy them in Persia. Over and over, the seed of the serpent tries to destroy the seed of the woman. And every time, God it's so crazy when you actually see this. God preserves a remnant and defeats the enemy. And so, with all that being said, let's go back to the Valley of Elah. So you've got Goliath from the giant clans wearing serpent armor, defying the armies of the living God, representing the seed of the serpent. And he's threatening to destroy Israel and prove that Yahweh is powerless. And then standing against him is David from Bethlehem, from the tribe of Judah, in the messianic line. A shepherd who's about to become king. The seed of the woman about to crush the serpent's head. And here's where that detail about the 5 stones comes in. It's really interesting to notice that David actually picks up 5 smooth stones. And, I always thought that this is, I don't know, maybe he was nervous about missing or something like that. Well, Goliath, as we pointed out before, has 4 brothers, 4 other giants from Gath who will show up later in 2 Samuel and got killed by David's men. And so I don't think David is bringing 5 stones because he's worried that he'll miss. Seems to be bringing 5 stones because he's planning for multiple targets. 1 stone per giant. And it seems to be that that's a warrior who understands exactly what he's up against. So this is what's actually happening in the Valley of Elah. This isn't a military skirmish. This is actually, I'll just use the term theological warfare. It's the continuation of Genesis 3:15, the seed of the woman versus the seed of the serpent. Israel versus the remnants of the giant clans. Yahweh versus the forces of chaos and corruption. And God's champion, ironically enough, isn't the impressive king with the armor and the height. It's the shepherd boy from Bethlehem. But before David can face Goliath, he needs to be prepared. And that's what we need to talk about next. Because David's background is anything but random, and it is kind of one of the biggest parts to this whole story. And this is what the text tells us about David's preparation. The Bible says that he was the youngest of 8 sons, which meant that he got the job that nobody else wanted, shepherding his father's sheep. And we need to understand what shepherding actually meant in the ancient world. Because contrary to those nice fields with all those sheep everywhere, it wasn't this peaceful pastoral gig where you sit on a hill and play the flute. Shepherding was ultimately a combat role because you're in the wilderness, far from civilization, and you are responsible for very valuable property, sheep, because they were expensive, and losing them meant economic disaster for not only you, but your family. And you're also in a territory where predators live, like bears, lions, and wolves. So when Saul tells David that he can't fight Goliath because he's just a boy, this is what David responds with. He just gives him his resume. In 1 Samuel 17:34-36, he says this: "Your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it down, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it, and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear." So this wasn't just a one-time lucky encounter. This was David pretty much sharing his repeated experience. And also notice the methodology here. He went after the predator. He didn't run away or wait for help. He pursued it. And when it turned on him, he just grabbed it and killed it hand to hand. So that's a warrior right there. This is someone who's been in life or death situations and has prevailed. And here's the key thing about that. This is how David spent his time in the wilderness, alone when no one was watching. Every day he was out there practicing with the sling because that's how you protect a flock. You keep predators at range. You don't let them get close enough to scatter the sheep. So if David is getting thousands of hours of practice with this weapon, building muscle memory, learning to judge distance, accounting for wind like a physics class, hit moving targets, and the sling, by the way, is not a toy. This needs to be said because most people picture like a slingshot type thing, like that Y-shaped stick with rubber bands. It's actually a completely different weapon that was invented in the 1840s. A biblical sling is a pouch with 2 cords that you could spin to build momentum before releasing a stone. And so in skilled hands, these things could actually launch stones at like 60 to 100 miles an hour over 200 to 400 yards. So ancient armies had specialized slinger units because they were devastatingly effective. Now, remember those 700 Benjaminite slingers who could sling a stone at a hair and not miss? Expert slingers really could achieve that kind of precision. I think there was the Balearic Islanders were actually so famous for their slinging that they were employed as mercenaries across the Mediterranean. So David isn't practicing with a toy. He's mastering a legitimate military weapon. And there's one more detail that confirms David was already recognized as the warrior before the Goliath fight even happened. Back in 1 Samuel 16, when David is brought to Saul's court to play music, one of Saul's servants describes him like this: "Behold, I have seen a son of Jesse the Bethlehemite, who is skillful in playing, a mighty man of valor, a man of war, and prudent in speech, and a handsome person, and the Lord is with him." So David is described as a mighty man of valor and a man of war. Mind you, this is before Goliath. So people are already calling David a warrior. So when David shows up to the Valley of Elah and volunteers to fight, he doesn't seem to be this native kid who just doesn't understand what he's getting into. He seems to be trained, he seems to have experience, and as a fighter who recognizes exactly what's happening. And also, David seems to be the only one who sees the theological stakes. Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? And he has the skills to do something about it. God prepared David through years in the wilderness, through confrontations with predators, through daily practice with the sling, through combat experiences when no one else was watching. And now the moment has come to use that preparation. All right, so Saul has agreed to let David fight, but he makes one last attempt to control the situation. He offers David his own armor, bronze scale armor, helmet, sword, just like what Goliath was wearing. Now, most people read this as Saul was being generous, trying to protect David, but let's think about what's actually happening here. If David goes out wearing Saul's armor, and if David wins, who gets the credit? The soldiers might think it was Saul himself who went out there. Or at the very least, they would see Saul's armor and associate the victory with Saul's house. So Saul is trying to claim the honor even if he won't fight it himself. But David tries on the armor, walks around and says, "Yeah, I can't go in these because I'm just not used to them at all." And then he just takes it all off. And so this isn't about the armor being heavy, because David is a specialist. He's not a heavy infantryman warrior who fights hand to hand with sword and spear. He's a ranged weapon specialist. So armor would ultimately restrict his mobility, slow him down, change his center of gravity. And for what he's about to do, armor is actually a liability. So David picks up his shepherd's staff, chooses 5 smooth stones from a stream, puts them in his bag, and with sling in his hand approaches Goliath. And Goliath is ultimately insulted. "Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks?" He curses David by his gods and promises to feed his flesh to the wild birds and the animals. And here's David's response: "You come to me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I will strike you down and cut off your head." To reiterate, it seems to be like David is making a theological declaration. David is absolutely clear who is going to get the credit. This isn't about David's skill, though he has skill. It's ultimately about God's power proving itself against the seed of the serpent. And then comes the key tactical moment. As the Philistine moved closer to attack him, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet him. Now, Goliath is a heavy infantry warrior, probably 150 plus pounds of armor and big weapons, and he's big and strong, but he's not fast. So he's built for close combat. David, on the other hand, is fast, mobile, and a range specialist. And so by running towards Goliath, he's actually closing the distance pretty quickly, and Goliath just seems to have one vulnerability. He's covered in armor, bronze helmet, scale armor, greaves, and a shield bearer in the front, but there's one gap: the face. The helmet has to have an opening for the eyes and the nose. And so that's the target. Reaching into his bag and taking out a stone, he slung it and struck the Philistine on the forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground. With one shot in the forehead, David knocks out Goliath. And the stone doesn't just hit him, it sinks into his skull. The impact was so hard that it literally cracked his bone and either concussed him directly or damaged his brain. So Goliath ends up going down, and then David runs over, pulls out Goliath's own sword, and cuts off his head. Think about that symbolism for a second. Genesis 3:15 says, "He will crush your head." Goliath wearing the serpent armor, David crushing his head with a stone, and then using the serpent's own weapon against him. This is the pattern of divine warfare throughout the Bible. God defeats evil by turning the enemy's weapons back on themselves. And when the Philistines see their champion dead, they just scatter and run. And when Israel sees Goliath defeated, they surge forward and shout and pursue. That is the honor restored. The God of Israel has once again proven his supremacy. The divine battle is won, but unfortunately the story is not over, because now comes the real test and really the big point of this video. So Goliath is dead, the Philistines are running, Israel is celebrating, and then we get this moment that always seemed weird. Saul turns to his commander Abner and says, "Whose son is that young man?" His commander says, "I don't know." And then Saul says, "Well, find out whose son he is." And then David is brought before Saul holding Goliath's severed head, and then Saul asks him directly, "Whose son are you, young man?" Now, if you're reading this in a modern Western context, like I am, this just seems like a simple question about genealogy. But in the ancient Near Eastern context of honor and shame culture, this question is doing something very, very specific. Saul is not asking this question to get information. He's making a claim. And in that culture, when a king asks, "Whose son are you?" after someone has won a great victory, he's offering to adopt that person into his household. He's essentially claiming them. Because if David becomes Saul's son, then Saul's household gets the honor from the victory. The king saves face, and then the narrative becomes Saul's household defeated Goliath, instead of some shepherd kid did what the king was too afraid to do. And now, from David's perspective, this is an incredibly tempting offer. Because think about what's being offered here. David is being offered safety, royalty, wealth, status. Like everything pragmatically makes sense about saying yes. But there's a problem. And that problem is David knows something Saul doesn't know that he knows. You see, back in 1 Samuel 16, before any of this stuff had just happened, the prophet Samuel came to Bethlehem and secretly anointed David as the next king of Israel. It wasn't public for David's protection, because if Saul found out, he would practically kill him. But David was anointed as God's chosen to be the next king. And his whole family witnessed it. So that honor, or the honor of being chosen by God, of being anointed, of having a son who will be king, that honor was given to Jesse's household, to David's family. And now Saul is trying to steal it. If David says, "I am your son, O king," he immediately gets safety and status, but he surrenders the honor God gave to his family. He submits to Saul's manipulation, and he chooses the pragmatic path over trusting God's plan. And God's plan, remember, makes no sense at this moment. David was anointed king, but Saul is still on the throne. So there's no visible path to David actually becoming king. As far as he knows, Saul has all the power, and he has the army, and he has the throne. So if David refuses him here, Saul can make his life miserable, which, spoiler alert, is actually what happens. The smart play, the pragmatic play, is to submit to Saul, accept the adoption, take the royal status, figure out the kingship thing later. But David doesn't do that. He looks at Saul and he says, "I am the son of your servant Jesse, the Bethlehemite." Not, "I am your son." Not, "I belong to your household." "I am Jesse's son from Bethlehem, from the family that God chose." David refuses to surrender the honor. He refuses to let Saul rewrite the narrative, and he trusts that God's plan, the plan that makes no sense, the plan that's going to put him in danger, is actually going to work out. And Saul loses. But Saul doesn't admit defeat. In 1 Samuel 18, verse 2, it says, "From that day, Saul kept David with him, and he did not let him return home to his family." So Saul essentially kidnaps him, takes him by force, and then tries to claim him for his household anyway. And from this point on, Saul's goal is to kill David, to eliminate the threat, to destroy the person that God had chosen to replace him. And then David spends the next several years running, hiding, and living in caves and fleeing to enemy territory, barely surviving. All because he's trusting God's plan instead of taking the easy path. And here's what's most fascinating about the story. The story of David and Goliath, the way we usually tell it, is about faith defeating impossible odds. The little guy with the tiny little sling with enough faith can beat the giant. And that's true, but it's incomplete, because the real test of David's faith isn't fighting Goliath. Goliath is dangerous, sure, but David has the right skills for that fight. He was trained for it. He knows he can win. The real test is standing in front of Saul with all of Saul's power and authority and offers of safety, and yet choosing to trust God's invisible plan instead. That's the battle that matters. And that's ultimately the climax of the story. Yeah, David defeats Goliath with a stone, but he defeats Saul's manipulation with his faith. And that sets up everything that follows in 1 Samuel. All the conflict, all the near-death experiences, all the years that David spends in waiting, it's because David refused to compromise. He refused to surrender what God had given him, even when keeping it meant suffering. And ultimately, who would be surprised, God's plan works out. David does become king, Saul falls, and the promise is fulfilled. But it takes years, and it requires David to trust God through circumstances that make no sense. And I think this is the part of the story that we need to sit with. So here's what's interesting when you actually zoom out and look at the story in the context of the biblical narrative. This pattern, the seed of the woman versus the seed of the serpent, shows up over and over. And every time it follows the same structure. The seed of the serpent looks powerful, impressive, armored, backed by armies or political authority. Goliath with his scale armor and massive weapons. Saul with his throne and his power to make David's life horrible. And the seed of the woman looks weak, unimpressive, unexpected, a shepherd or the youngest son with no armor, no political power. But the seed of the woman always has something that the seed of the serpent doesn't have. They have God's promise, God's anointing, and God's plan. And God defeats evil not through impressive displays of overwhelming force, but by turning the enemy's weapons against them. The serpent uses a tree to bring death in Eden. Jesus uses a tree, the cross, to bring life. Goliath trusts in his armor and his weapons. David uses Goliath's own sword to cut off his head. Saul uses his political power to try and control David, but that very persecution drives David into the wilderness where he becomes the man after God's own heart. Every time, the enemy's strength becomes an instrument of their defeat. And this pattern points forward to Jesus, the ultimate seed of the woman, born in Bethlehem, just like David, called the Good Shepherd, just like David, from the line of David, the king. And Jesus faces the ultimate seed of the serpent, Satan himself. And it happens in the wilderness, just like David's preparation. 40 days of temptation, just like 40 days of Goliath's taunting. And Jesus defeats Satan not with military might or political power, but by letting Satan strike his heel, the cross, and using that very moment to crush the serpent's head. The cross ultimately looks like defeat. Jesus looks weak. He's beaten, he's mocked, he's killed. The serpent thinks he won. But death itself becomes the very weapon that defeats death. The apparent loss is the actual victory. And David killing Goliath, then refusing to submit to Saul's manipulation, is the preview of that pattern. It's showing us how God works, not just through the impressive or the powerful or the armored, but through shepherds, through the youngest son, through the one who looks weak but has God's promise. And, it's showing us that the real battle isn't always the visible one. Sometimes the real test isn't defeating the obvious enemy. It might just be it's trusting God's plan when you're literally standing in front of someone who has all the power and is offering you an easier path. Goliath is the giant that everyone seems to see. Saul's manipulation is the battle that actually matters. And David wins both. Not because he's impressive, but because he trusts the God who prepared him in the wilderness and promised to make him king. So yeah, David and Goliath, not quite the story that we thought. It's not just about an underdog with a lucky shot in a sling. It's honestly about theological warfare. The seed of the woman versus the seed of the serpent. The political intrigue with a corrupt king trying to steal glory from God's chosen and trusting God's plan even when it makes no sense and puts you in danger. The fight with Goliath was ultimately just the setup. The real battle is David standing before Saul and choosing faith over pragmatism. And in that pattern, God working through the unexpected, turning the enemy's weapons against them, defeating evil through apparent weakness, that pattern holds all the way to the cross. And that's kind of the whole point. So, thank you for watching.